Matthew?
How's the audio?
Hi. There we go. So this is Professor Rosenbloom. Is he on? Yeah.
Hi.
Oh, hi. Oh, well, I just wanted to show them without everybody having to. Yeah. So. Try to. There we go. Great. Can you talk for a minute? I'll see him. Hi. Can you see me or?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Hello. Well, I think everyone can hear you. Not everyone can see you. I took you off the screen. I just wanted to say a couple words to you about the format. So it's not wildly different from what we emailed around. I'm going to pose a very, very broad question to everybody. I'm going to give everyone 5 minutes to do their intro. So you'll have 5 minutes to say whatever you want to introduce. And then I will give you a chance another if there's anything you're dying to say about. Can you hear me?
Yeah, the audio's, it kind of goes in and out. If you're talking to that monitor, but the camera that shows your face is actually away from the monitor.
All right, I don't know where the microphone is. You know what microphone?
I think it's probably closer to the table.
I just don't want to start seeing. Anyway, I don't think it's relatively straightforward. I think it's okay.
Yeah.
All right, so it's fine. And the only thing I'm doing is I want to make sure Can you hear?
There's a fair amount of noise in the room that makes it a bit harder to hear.
I think you can't hear her very clearly.
I hear you pretty well, Tarika.
Can you hear Jacob from the IT? Yeah. Or Brad. They're supposed to be here, but I don't know where he is. Whatever the problem is that if you can't hear us, it's going to be very hard for you to see. I'm just trying to figure out what microphone you are hearing. I'm going to try.
I think it's definitely not talking to that monitor doesn't help because I don't see your face.
You can hear. Okay, never mind. Okay.
I hear better when you're not talking to that monitor because there's no microphone or.
Okay.
Yeah, it's better.
Okay. So maybe the I think it might be the yeah, because then we have 2 mics going on.
Yeah, because the main point is when you talk to that monitor where you're standing, Tarika, I can't see your face. I see the people in the room, but my face is.
I was going to say the main issue. The main thing is yeah, but I think you can hear the ambient. Yeah. I'm putting you back up on the screen, okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
But just don't. When you talk to me, don't talk to that monitor because then I don't see your face.
I'm putting you back up on the screen.
I'm at large. I feel like my viewpoint is like I'm sitting in the back of the room. So I'm way up in the bleachers.
Yeah. Okay.
But I think the audio will be fine once the background noise dies out.
I would just fill around. So if you have any problems hearing us, let us know. Okay?
Yep.
No, all right. Oh, really? Yeah.
actually good results.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Were you in my first tonight? I'm also a product of Oh yeah. You were just Right. So then instead of the seasonal. It is. I'm loud. I always really feel better to use my phone than not. Like I use it even though I don't have to. But I guess you'll hear it better because those microphones. Okay. I'll do my best. I have full device. Oh no, not for the digital community. Yeah. That's the idea. Always works. Everyone is down. We have a lot of space up front, and we will be using the iPhones. So because we have a lot of, you can all move on downward. Thank you. Thank you. Great presentation. Use it. And this way, everyone can hear what all our panelists are saying. The microphone. So brief introduction. This panel focuses on the legal constructions of borders, including both international and national policies, borders at the municipal level, community level, such as zoning. And we'll be exploring together how laws create the right to enter, the right to remain, and how this impacts our understanding of citizenship and belonging. And our moderator today is Professor Rachel Rosenbloom, Professor of Immigration Law and Policy at Northeastern University School of Law, and the co-director of the Immigrant Justice Clinic. She'll be introducing our panelists. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Just a brief explanation. We're not using the microphones because we have a participant who's joining us via Skype or whatever, however this is being, I'm not quite sure the technology, but via video. And he can hear us much better. You know, the sound's being picked up over there, and if I speak to the microphone, it sort of messes things up a little. So I'm gonna I've always been loud. Used to get me in trouble when I was a kid, but I think it'll come in handy now and try to talk without the microphone. So this is a panel about legal borders. Borders, I think, loom larger today than they have. I often find when I'm talking about contemporary issues around refugees being turned away in this country and other countries, I find myself reaching back sometimes into examples from the the first half of the 20th century, like the St. Louis, which was the boat that was carrying 900 Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany that was turned away from our shores, turned back to Europe. Things that are from before the 1951 convention. They kind of describe what the world we live in now. It's almost as if all these protections that were put in place after World War II in response to those kinds of incidents we're just sort of seeing them start to erode in various ways. And so we're all kind of focused at this moment, I think, on the U.S.-Mexico border, on these folks who are coming from Honduras. You saw, those of you here for the keynote, saw an image of kids, pushing a stroller on their way here, and of course, our president is sending the military and is threatening to shoot at these parents and children who are making their way towards the United States, and certainly in Europe, where for many years we've seen borders kind of dissolving within Europe and freedom of movement, and we're starting to see those borders coming up again. So legal borders are on our in a lot of ways. My own background is in immigration law, so I tend to be focused on people who are crossing borders, but this panel is taking on the question of legal borders in a much broader way. We're going to explore the many different ways that laws at all levels, local, state, national, international, divide and displace people, both across international borders, but also within national borders, and how policies, I think, because we have a focus on climate change here, so we're going to be talking about how policies at multiple levels either lead to the displacement of people by climate change, or fail to adequately address that displacement in various ways. So we have 3 panelists here. Matthew, can you hear us? Good. Okay, great. So I am going to introduce the panelists. I'm going to introduce all of them, right? Give them each. I'm going to invite them to take 5 minutes or so to kind of explain how they come to this issue, what their perspective is, and then give them a chance to respond to one another and maybe throw some questions at them, and then open it up to all of you. So I will start by introducing Matthew Scott. Matthew Scott leads the People on the Move team at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law in Sweden. He focuses in particular on the international legal status of persons who are displaced in the context of disasters and climate change. His doctoral thesis was entitled Refugee Status Determination in the Context of Natural Disasters, natural has quotes on it, and Climate Change, a Human Rights-Based Approach. And he also has 15 years of experience working in the field of international migration at a variety of organizations, including the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. So next, I'll introduce Linda Evarts, who is a staff attorney in the litigation department of the International Refugee Assistance Project. We have a chapter of IRAP here at Northeastern. We've got our students involved in their work. And she is involved there in systemic challenges to recent policies preventing refugees and others in danger from reaching safety in the United States. Her recent cases include IRAP versus Trump, challenging the Trump administration's 3rd Muslim ban, Doe v. Trump, challenging the administration's 3rd refugee ban, and SA versus Trump, challenging the termination of the Central American Minors Program. And then we have Shaun Goho, who is a lecturer on Harvard Law School, deputy director and staff attorney of the Emmett Environmental Law and Policy Clinic. He worked for several years in the Seattle Office of Earth Justice, where he litigated in state and federal court with an emphasis on Endangered Species Act and water rights issues. And since joining the clinic in 2008, he's worked on a variety of issues. His current projects include work on issues such as citizen science, climate change, displacement, and lead in drinking water. I think there is basically one broad overarching question that informs all of our work, and I'm going to just throw it out to you. I'm going to invite you to spend 5 minutes just talking through these issues. And that question is, how do laws create these artificial categories that determine who gets to stay someplace, who has to leave, who has to move domestically, who can move domestically, who has to move internationally, who can't move internationally. So that's kind of the topic before us. And why don't we start with Shaun, and then Linda, and then Matthew. Just take 5 minutes to tell us your perspective on it.
Sure. So as an environmental lawyer, I'm probably coming at this from a slightly different perspective. One thing that has struck me about the discussion so far today is how it's been, that climate displacement is a huge problem, global in scale. And so the perspective I'm just going to offer briefly here is starting on a much smaller scale. And thinking of a village called Newtok in Alaska, which probably many of you have heard about in the news. Newtok is a Yupik Eskimo village on the Bering Sea of approximately 400 people. The location of the village was the site of a seasonal camp for thousands of years, but it has only been permanently occupied since 1959, when the Bureau of Indian Affairs established a school there. It is, as I mentioned, basically on the coast of the Bering Sea, immediately adjacent to the Ninglik River, and as a result of various climate change related impacts, such as the melting of permafrost, the lack of winter sea ice forming, which prevents the sea ice from protecting the shore from damage from winter storms. As a result of that, there's been hundreds of feet of coastal erosion happening in Newtok over the last several decades. And in fact, just about, I saw a news story just a couple of weeks ago that about 40 feet of shoreline had been lost within a couple of weeks, between the end of September, beginning of October, to the point where now there are, for the first time, homes that are literally on the edge of a precipice about to fall off. Newtok is not alone in this predicament. A report of the Government Accountability Office in 2009 identified 30 other small villages in Alaska in a similar situation. So because of these threats, the people of Newtok voted back in 1994 to relocate to a new site. It is now farther along in that relocation process than any other Alaska Native village. And in fact, the expectation is that by next fall, they'll have the first permanently occupied homes in their new site called Nektivik. So on the one hand, it's actually potentially a success story. It's really a tribute to the efforts of all the people in the communities and the many state and federal agencies and NGOs like the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, who have helped make this happen. On the other hand, by the time people permanently relocate, it will be 25 years since the decision was taken to move. People are, at this moment, losing their homes, and they don't currently have any place to move to. And it was not at all an easy process to get to where they are now. So even to acquire the site for Nektivik, it took a special act of Congress in 2002 to get that done after 8 years of negotiations. To get the money for that first home to be built this year and occupied next year, it took a special $15 million appropriation from Congress this year. So our clinic is engaged in a process to look at what kinds of lessons can be learned from what's happened with the Newtok relocation process. And a couple of themes have emerged from it, and maybe these would be things that we will be able to connect to some of the other things we'll hear about. So first theme is that legal barriers to relocation are not only things on an international scale, such as the Refugee Convention or the way the Framework Convention on Climate Change work, but there are lots of national laws and policies in areas you wouldn't think about. They don't seem at all related to climate change or to displacement that actually present significant barriers to relocation from happening. Things like the fact that the school district won't build a new school until there are 25 families living at the new site. The families don't want to move to the new site until the new school. The Indian Health Services Sanitation Facilities Construction Program will not build a water or sewer system until there are occupied homes. But who wants to move to a place and occupy a home until that system is built? Something like the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Grant Program would seem to be a great funding mechanism for this kind of relocation, but to qualify for that program, it generally requires a federal disaster declaration, which is going to be great for responding after the fact to a sudden onset disaster, but not so great for dealing with slow moving and yet entirely predictable funds. It funds only 90% of the costs, so who's going to cover the other 10%? The village does not have the money to cover that. It prioritizes spending based on what they call cost effectiveness, which if you're talking about how expensive it is to do things in a remote Alaskan village that is not connected to the road system, means they're always going to rank lower in priority than things that are happening in the lower 48. And even if they do qualify for something, say the buyout of homes under this program, the entire presumption of the program is that they give you money and that there's a market for homes, and you take that money and buy another home somewhere else. That market just does not exist here. Instead, what you need to do is take the money and build a new home, and they just aren't equipped to think about how they even deal with that. And in fact, one of the requirements of the program is that when they pay you money to buy out your home, you have to leave it within 90 days. That doesn't leave enough time to build a new home. The point here is that they're just within the domestic framework of internally displaced people in the United States, there are many, many laws, regulations, and policies that create barriers to relocation. They're not the kinds of things you would think about when you're thinking about climate. And to try to solve these problems, you really need to get into the weeds of what all these laws, regulations, and policies. Just briefly, a second theme that's emerged is, again, just as there is no framework or no entity on the international level that deals with climate migration, similarly, there's no such entity or governing framework in the United States. There's no single funding source. The community has to patch together funding from many different sources. There's no single coordinating agency. Instead, they've had an ad hoc working group of more than two dozen agencies that have been working on this for more than a decade. Just recently, there is this independent agency in Alaska called the Denali Commission, which has taken on a little bit of a coordinating role, but it's doing so only because President Obama tasked them with doing that back in 2015, and basically because President Trump probably doesn't know they're doing it right now. And honestly, because Lisa Murkowski supports it. So they don't have official statutory authorization to do it. They're dependent on year-by-year congressional funding. In Trump's budget request last year, he zeroed out the commissions. They would have ceased to exist if people like Lisa Murkowski hadn't continued to fund them. So there's no stability. There's no long-term framework for it. So basically, these efforts right now depend on political whim and ad hoc institutional arrangements, and really sort of the institutional knowledge that's in the heads of it could be lost. So our clinic has a project we're working on right now to try to really examine in detail what's happened and what's happening in Newtok, to try to do a couple of things. First of all, see if we can put together a guide for other communities to navigate this maze that Newtok's taken 25 years to get through. So hopefully other communities can do it faster, both in Alaska and elsewhere in the United States, as this problem starts to occur on a larger scale and in more places. And then secondly, try to identify places these laws, regulations, and policies can be improved to try to make the process easier for others. And then the long-term goal, of course, would be to come up with an overarching framework, one agency that's in charge. Unfortunately, that's probably still a long way off.
Thank you.
Great. So I'm Linda Evarts, and I'm from HIRA, the International Refugee Assistance Project. I'm interested to talk about how the current legal framework connects to our thoughts about belonging and who belongs in our body politic. So just to frame the larger issue, which I think we've already discussed a bunch today, but I know we have some new people in the room. There are 68.5 million people who've been forcibly displaced right now. The current crisis is unprecedented in its scope. Of those people, 25 million are refugees. And historically, the United States has led the world in resettling refugees, so allowing people to come here in safety. But in the last year, we've seen a really dramatic shift, and the United States went from accepting, on average, and this is again a very small percentage of the overall refugee population, but went from accepting on average 80,000 people a year, resettling those individuals, to approximately 30,000 refugees, and that number is only shrinking. And so, I think there's been a lot of talk about the Trump administration and what its policies, what the harms its policies are causing. I think it is undisputed in the refugee context and in the context of those who are internally displaced that the Trump administration, motivated by what only can be called animus toward Muslim people and toward Latino people in particular, has been doing everything it can to either push people who are already in our country out and to not let other people in. And I think that it's based on this idea of who belongs and who doesn't in this country. And it's in contrast to long-standing ideas about who belongs here. And so at IRAP, we've been providing direct services to refugees who are trying to come into the country for the last decade. But in response to the Trump administration's efforts to shut down the refugee program in its entirety, so not to allow any refugees in whatsoever, we developed a litigation department, of which I am now a part, that responded with broad-based systemic litigation. And so we've challenged the various iterations of the refugee ban beginning in January 2017 and the latest iteration, which was in October of 2017. And unlike the prior refugee bans, that refugee ban was specifically targeted at 9 Muslim majority countries. So it essentially was trying to shut down refugee admissions from the Muslim part of the US refugee admissions program. We were successful in getting a preliminary injunction of that suspension, and we are continuing to litigate this case now, despite the fact that the Trump administration has said that our litigation is moot and it is no longer suspending refugee admissions from those countries. But if you look at the numbers, essentially no one has entered, even after our injunction was in place. We've also challenged other efforts by the Trump administration to shut down smaller programs that are targeting very specific individuals. So for example, the Lautenberg program was allowing religious minorities from Iran to come to this country as refugees. And historically, anyone who had entered the program, and the way that it worked was that in order to enter the program, you first went through initial processing in Iran, and then if it looked like you were eligible for the program, you'd be moved to Vienna for the final stages of processing. Anyone who moved to Vienna in the past was essentially knew that they were selling everything they owned and putting their lives in Iran behind in order to come to the United States. Almost everyone, 100%, was approved. And then almost immediately after the Trump administration came to power, there were denials across the board of the 100 people who had applications outstanding with no reason whatsoever. These are just 2 examples, and I could talk about a lot more, but I think the idea is that we've been trying to work within the existing legal framework, which already did provide quite a bit of protection to people, in order to make sure that the Trump administration is not able to shut down our borders and to shut down access to protection for people who so desperately need it.
Thank you. Matthew.
Hi. I feel a bit like Big Brother here to the masses. So we've always been at war with Oceania, so don't believe anything I say. But what I'm going to say in response to the question, first of all, is I think speaking from the sort of international law perspective, my interests relate to the convention relating to the status of refugees, as well as regional human rights law like the European Convention on Human Rights. Speaking about the convention, the Refugee Convention in particular, it's worth looking at it as an instrument that, rather than in the first instance constructing barriers, it's actually intended to break down some barriers. It's about facilitating entry of people and stay of people and integration of people in host countries when they can't go back to their countries of origin or habitual residence. So it's an example of law kind of, it's almost quite a unique example of international law breaking down some national barriers to human mobility. But you can find within it barriers nonetheless. So if you take the Convention relating to the status of refugees definition of a refugee, it's very long and it's very narrow. So even though we're interested in providing international protection to people who need it, the people who qualify are a very narrow band of people who, from a larger mass of people who face different kinds of adversity. So to qualify as a refugee, you need to establish a well-founded fear of being persecuted for one of 5 convention reasons: race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion. And that excludes probably more people than it includes. So that's my first point, that the convention opens up, but at the same time it closes. But a second point I'd like to think about relates to the role of practitioners in relation to the law and the kind of barriers that we as lawyers and judges and other legal practitioners can construct that don't necessarily have to be there in the first place. And this relates to the way we interpret the provisions within, whether it's international or domestic legal frameworks. So speaking about displacement in the context of climate change or disasters, most people who have engaged with the question of the application of the Refugee Convention in that context pretty much dismiss the possibility of people qualifying. And that, as I've written in my doctoral work, is based to a large extent on how we understand the refugee definition and some assumptions there, as well as what we think about when we think about this kind of displacement. And I was pleased to hear Jacqueline Baba mention earlier in her keynote the centrality of discrimination in this context. So if you can establish a discriminatory element in the movement, then you have a way of breaking down that barrier. So I've got a lot more I could say about the Refugee Convention in this context, both as a way of opening up some barriers, but also of closing down. But there's another example within the European Convention on Human Rights in terms of creating barriers. The well-known protection available under Article 3 of the European Convention, which prohibits, as a consequence of judicial interpretation, prohibits return to countries where people would face inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, is progressive, has been criticized by many states as being too progressive, but judicial interpretation has firmly drawn the line at how far that kind of protection goes, in terms of saying it's prohibited to send people back to torture, it's prohibited to send people back to inhuman or degrading treatment, but sending people back to adverse environmental conditions, that is beyond the scope of the convention. And so there's some thinking that can be done there. But if I generalize my point, it's that the law has scope to restrict and to open up, and it's the role of practitioners to engage with that.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for those. I have a bunch of follow-up questions for all of you, but before I jump in, does anyone have anything that they want to, any response they want to give, anything that one of you said that sparked a thought in the other? No obligation, but I'm giving you a chance.
Well,
You're recognized. Please.
Thank you. I was thinking in relation to the resettlement situation in Alaska. It made me think a bit about the work that we're doing in Asia and the Pacific with the Raoul Wallenberg Institute on displacement there, and the role of national law and policy in addressing situations, both preventing displacement as well as protecting people during displacement. And it was really interesting to hear about the minutiae that really gets in the way of effective protection in those kind of contexts. And I think it's a really interesting intersection between sort of, I work a lot with the guiding principles on internal displacement, which is the international soft law framework that is recognized by the General Assembly and others as being an effective tool to be used by practitioners at all levels for dealing with internal displacement. But it's quite a general framework. It's got a number of principles relating to prevention and protection and durable solutions. But it's difficult to overlay onto the existing complexity of domestic frameworks. You know, those examples of not being able to set up a school unless you have 25 people there and stuff like that. That's the reality of internal displacement, local and national law and policy that's complicated. And the thing that we talk a lot about when we're working in Asia and the Pacific is the relevance of taking a human rights-based approach to the phenomenon, and what does that entail for duty bearers at all levels. So I don't know how far a human rights-based approach works at the local level in Alaska, but it's complicated, and it was interesting to hear how complicated it can be in this situation.
Great, thank you. What strikes me about the presentation so far is how many different levels of government we've been referencing simultaneously. Right, we're talking about international law. We're talking about national law, and if we start talking about FEMA or something of that sort, you're talking about national law, and and then. But I'm also, I think you're getting into the weeds a bit on local law as well, right? And school districts and setting up sewers and those kinds of things. So I think this is a question for all of you is where you look to, when you look out at these various levels, and certainly in Europe you have kind of regional, EU level lawmaking as well. And so where are the positive, here in the United States, right, the positive changes are not happening at the national level right now. I think it's safe to say, right, we've turned local in many ways, certainly around issues and environmental issues. But for all of you, where are the kind of the positive changes coming? Where are the negative changes coming from? And do you see strategies kind of emerging in terms of where you might want to look for changes?
Okay, sure. I'll start. Sure. So a couple of thoughts there. I mean, one, if you look at what's happened or what's happening in Alaska, I mean, it is remarkable that it is quite a collective of people working, the people in the local community working together with people from state agencies and from federal agencies. So it really is a collaboration at all domestic levels of government. I think really a key lesson from what's happening in New talking about all of those villages is that it's essential that the outcome really be driven by the local community's desires and goals, and it can't be something that's imposed from the top down, because of course the very reason that they were permanently located in such dangerous place is because of a requirement from the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so they've been placed in harm's way from a top-down perspective. So it really has to be a bottom-up driven process for ensuring that they get to move as they want. I will say, in terms of where you look for hopeful action, one thing that's very striking about what's happening there is that you have a lot of people in the Alaskan state government and the federal government who are really engaged in positive action here and trying to make things work. It's also striking that there have been ebbs and flows over the time it's happened in terms of when funding is available and how hospitable the governor or the president is to this kind of action, and that a lot of the times, people working on it have to sort of keep their heads down and not necessarily be sort of outspoken about what it is they're doing, which is really unfortunate in terms of trying to get that central direction. But I was struck by this, having a recent conversation with someone from a federal agency working on this, and had an entire hour-long conversation. The words climate change never passed his lips. He was talking about native villages were moving in response to environmental change, and so I guess the message is that we're at a very difficult time right now domestically in terms of doing this, but and certainly a lot more is happening at local and state levels and federal level right now, but that even at the federal level, there are still people trying to do good work there.
So I think there's no question that what is happening with the executive right now at the federal level is deeply distressing, as I already talked about. Is it obviously an effort to keep people out and to get out people who are already here? I would say though that there have been there have been a lot of successes by our organization and other similar organizations in enforcing federal law guarantees in order to stop what the administration is trying to do, because it's not following the basics of federal law. And I think, you'll find a lot of civil rights lawyers right now who are very excited about the Administrative Procedure Act, which did not, when I was in law school, was definitely my admin students here in the room. Okay, when I was in law school, now, it's really deeply important, and it imposes constraints on how agencies act. They have to act transparently. They have to provide reasons for their decisions. These are very basic things, but they're not happening right now in the sort of chaotic, unprecedented efforts to get people out. And so I think, we have succeeded, we at IRAP have succeeded in getting quite a few at this point legal successes, both preliminary injunctions, motions for summary judgment granted, that have shut down what the Trump administration is trying to do, either temporarily or permanently. And other organizations have had similar successes. And so I would say, don't forget about federal law here. But separately, some of the people or some of the entities that are bringing those actions are states. And I think, attorney general's offices and states are really exciting places to work right now. And I would encourage you to think about that, because states are saying, this isn't right, and trying to enforce federal law to protect their own citizens.
Yeah, coming outside of the USA and thinking particularly about the work that we're doing in Asia and the Pacific, I think the positive processes underway are very much in the context of disaster risk management and climate change adaptation. There's a lot of interest on the part of states in countries and regions that are adversely affected by changing weather patterns to really develop robust mechanisms for dealing with the challenges presented by climate change, and doing it in a way that is based on more modern ways of understanding exposure and vulnerability to disaster risks. So there seems to be a sea change since the introduction of the Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction that has states thinking about how to actively protect people before disaster strikes. Instead of being responsive to disasters and using primarily military intervention to sort of evacuate people, there's more engagement with rights-based and gender-equal approaches to this. And I see that a lot in the work that we're doing in Asia and the Pacific in particular. But this way of thinking is built into international level frameworks on disaster risk reduction. And I think that's a positive step. It's positive in the context of displacement in this connection, because if you can prevent harm that arises in the context of disasters, then you can prevent displacement in the first place. There's a bit more to be done in terms of integrating displacement into these disaster risk management and climate change adaptation frameworks. But there are processes there underway as well, led by a number of organizations, including the Platform on Disaster Displacement and the UN Strategy on Disaster Risk Reduction. And there's interest on the part of some states, at least, in doing that. So that's a positive. Negative, speaking from Sweden and Europe in general, we see a lot of the same kind of things that you're seeing in the USA, in terms of significant increases in xenophobia. And this is obviously not restricted to people who move in the context of climate change, but human mobility in general. And so I think that was raised in the keynote as well. It's been raised on this panel. Dealing with people's fear of other people is a major challenge for a situation of human mobility, the scale of which the planet has never seen. We've got to figure out how to live together in challenging times, in an Anthropocene where life is potentially going to be much more difficult in terms of production of food, in terms of exposure to adverse weather, stuff like that. Strategies, well, more on disaster risk management and climate change adaptation. But when it comes to strategies for dealing with these levels of mobility and the challenge of xenophobia, I think one concrete strategy, I really liked Jacqueline Baba's proposal for the sort of educational mobility. But another idea, going more to that local level, like you've been talking about, is something I saw working in Australia with kind of regional sponsored migration streams. So you can have different parts of a country saying, well, we actually need people in the far north of Sweden. And so we're going to say we need 2,000 people and preferably carpenters or something like that. So you can manage it. Because one way of dealing with the xenophobia is showing that the state's able to manage this situation. It's the unmanaged consequences that create fear. And that unmanaged aspect relates also to what happens once people arrive. And we've also seen that in Europe quite a bit, as Jacqueline Baba referenced, the kind of changing levels of enthusiasm for new arrivals. If we can deal with new arrivals better in terms of making people feel at home, then I think that goes a long way towards dealing with the challenges that we're facing.
Yeah, and I think I'm always struck by this disconnect between the local or regional and national, in the sense that there are a lot of areas that really, particularly cities in the United States, are very much welcoming immigrants in many cases, and then, but of course, at least in the United States, there's no way for a city or a state to intervene in this because immigration law is entirely federal, and so there's this sort of struggle set up. And I know travel around Europe, there's so many cities where you see the big refugees welcome signs, on City Hall, for example, in large cities, and yet you have these different policies at the national level.
Sorry, just to quickly respond to that, I really see a lot of scope for the municipal sort of cities' responses there, perhaps even as kind of test cases or something. If Barcelona could say, well, we really want to be a human rights city, we can welcome people in some. I mean, you look at Canada with the private sponsorship. You can have other kind of examples at the municipal level, municipal sponsored schemes that you still have to persuade the central government though. So it's a challenge.
Well, I think one of the challenges for this panel, we're trying to talk about climate refugees, is that there's so many barriers to refugees in general, like even refugees who fit into the standard definition, that we could talk all day just about that. So just to bring it back now, I think, to the particular challenges around climate refugees. So there's two divisions, two kind of artificial distinctions in a way that have been raised here. One is the distinction in international law between a refugee and the very different implications of that under the law. And I'm struck by the fact, if someone's internally displaced, they don't have all the, whatever meager protections that do exist under international law. I shouldn't say meager; they're significant. But on the other hand, if they're in a place like the United States, maybe there's FEMA money. There could be some significant assistance and funding if you can figure out a way to get to it. But of course, in many countries, you're not going to have that kind of infrastructure at the domestic level. So the people who are cut out of the international framework are going to have a very hard time. The other distinction that we've run up against is this distinction within the Refugee Convention. Who counts as a refugee, and it's not just first of all, there's the requirement that you show that the persecution is on account of one of the 5 grounds, right? Race, religion, nationality, political opinion, particular social group. And maybe that particular social group, people have tried to expand it, but it's a little tough to do it for climate refugees. But even more so, the fact that you need to show persecution, right, by a government or by a non-government actor who is operating without the government intervening. And so that's a huge challenge when you've got people who are displaced by climate change. And I'm wondering, I mean, there's other issues that also come up against those barriers. So for example, people fleeing civil strife situations or generalized violence have also had a hard time fitting into the definition of a refugee. And there are many countries in Africa and Latin America that have adopted broader definitions of refugees that recognize foreign aggression, that recognize civil strife as generalized violence as reasons to grant refugee status. So I'm wondering, what's our feeling about, in the final analysis, do we feel like that we need a totally new framework to deal with climate refugees? Do we feel like there's something in our existing framework that we can expand? What's the way forward on recognizing climate refugees under some sort of international framework? And I guess also for you, Shaun, in terms of the distinction between internally displaced persons and refugees. What's the way forward? So, yeah. Sure. Well, no, let's shake it up a little. Linda, can we ask you to?
Well, I think I might just take a step back for a moment because I think there's been quite a bit of talk about actions, and this is, I'm sorry, not directly responsive to your question, but it's pretty out of my wheelhouse. But I think there's quite a bit of talk so far about different actions like not passing or ending the DACA program, or trying to end the DACA program, and trying to end TPS, the family separation initiative of the Trump administration. So like talk about specific programs that have been ended or new programs that are targeted at people to try to get people out of the United States. But I think something that I haven't heard mention of yet is the efforts by Jeff Sessions to constrict the existing definitions of who is eligible for asylum. And as I think people in this room probably know, asylum and refugee are just different sides of the same coin. It depends on whether you're inside the United States, in which case you're applying for asylum, or if you're outside of the United States and trying to come in, then you're applying for refugee resettlement. And so I think, a lot of that work has been done by Jeff Sessions at the part of the definition that's for a particular social group, which in the past had been interpreted to include folks, for example, in Central America who were fleeing situations of domestic violence. There was talk about a gender-based dimension, a particular social group. So on the one hand, it could include people who were in domestic violence situations that they couldn't get out of. And on the other hand, people who were targeted by gangs, so non-state actors, but couldn't find state protection. And Sessions has referred to himself decisions by the BIA in order to reverse them and to try to do everything in his power, sort of just constrain and take away these sort of broader interpretations. In addition, something Sessions has done is he's taken a new case that he's referred to himself, certified to himself, and the idea being that folks who have already passed credible fear interviews, so folks who are applying for asylum in the United States, who've gone to that initial stage of the process and demonstrated that they're likely to have winning asylum claims at the end of the process, to try to keep those folks incarcerated for the duration of their claims, which has huge ramifications on the ability of people to actually see relief at the end of the day, or whether they ultimately give up. So I think those are just two things that I wanted to throw onto the table. That's what I got.
As other constraints of the system, sure. Shaun.
Okay, so the international law dimensions of who counts as a refugee and what the place person. I'll probably more to Matthew, who's written about this. But I'll say one thing that I think was raised by the New Talk example that I haven't made explicit yet is really one of the challenges there is the idea they want to move as a community. It's not about movements as individuals. The alternative, they are trying to go through a planning process to build a new village where they can relocate as a community, as a tribe, and maintain that cultural identity. The alternative is that eventually the village is going to be destroyed by a winter storm, and then they will be scattered to Anchorage and Fairbanks elsewhere, and then it will lose both that cultural cohesion and that tie to their ancestral land. So that's just another issue to put on the table. And then just one thing I just wanted to touch on that Max had talked about previously, talking about disaster risk reduction, and then also about the idea of municipal versus different levels of government. It's very striking in the United States right now that there's a lot of good work being done on climate change adaptation and therefore disaster risk reduction at the municipal level specifically, whereas we've got at the moment really nothing at the federal level. In fact, there are some really perverse incentives built into federal law right now, both under programs like the National Flood Insurance Program that subsidizes flood insurance that the market would not provide, so people are building homes in locations where they really shouldn't be built to see level rise happening. And then also with things like the Stafford Act, the main statute for disaster response. When there is a hurricane or other disaster that is destroying a home, they generally give people money to rebuild in place, even in some cases the same home being rebuilt or repaired 4 or 5 or 6 times, when really we should be, in some situations, clearly buying all those properties and trying to get people to relocate. And that the federal law is not in place for that.
Matthew.
Okay. New treaty has been up for a while. There's some initiatives. I think I saw something recently about Columbia University proposing a new framework. There's also something from the University of Limoges in France about a treaty for climate refugees. I think there's difficulties, probably quite a lot of difficulties with that. The main one, of course, being that states are pretty reluctant at the moment to sign up to any further international obligations relating to the movement of people into their territory. But it's also quite difficult to know how you would define the category of person who fits within such a new instrument. Who is a person who is forced to move in the context of climate change or disasters? And that goes to the multiple factors that contribute to mobility generally, where climate change is recognized more as a risk amplifier than a singular cause in and of itself. So I'm not a proponent of a new treaty, but rather see see it as almost the only way forward to be the development of a toolkit approach. This toolkit approach is what you find in the Nansen Initiative's agenda for the protection of persons displaced across borders in the context of disasters and climate change. What it means, and it's developed out of a series of regional consultations, it means developing good practices based on what states are already doing in some places. So facilitated visa regimes, maybe making it easier for people to leave dangerous situations with more innovative migration policies, stuff like that. Thinking about the circumstances in which the Refugee Convention may apply, maybe using the expanded definition for Latin America and Africa, as you mentioned. So that idea of multiple solutions rather than a single document that fixes everything. And that goes also to the idea of not necessarily having an international level solution, but really focused on the regional particularities. And that's something that came out pretty clearly in the Nansen Initiative's consultations, where, what works in the context of people moving from Somalia to Kenya in a drought isn't the same as what's going to work when people move between, say, Mexico and the USA. Or something like that. So there's also scope then for kind of bilateral arrangements being done. And this is really happening, actually, talking about positives. This is happening within the Central American context. The Regional Conference on Migration has developed guidelines for exactly this situation of people crossing borders in the situation of disasters and climate change. And it looks like there's moves for that kind of an arrangement to be developed further into South America as well. So there's importance in kind of bilateral or regional level approaches rather than international level. But then on the, if I've got another minute, on the Refugee Convention itself, I think there is scope, even within the 51 Convention, not the expanded definition. And, well, I've written my thesis on it, and I won't take the time it takes to describe all of it. But it depends very much on how we understand what disasters are. And a lot of the talk about climate refugees pitches the harm as originating from the atmosphere. And of course, climate change makes things worse. But the harm comes from the vulnerable social conditions. And it's very much recognized that people are differentially exposed and vulnerable. It's not everybody in a particular country that gets adversely affected in a disaster, but rather it's the people who are discriminated in everyday life who are disproportionately exposed. And that's got a gender dimension. It relates to ethnic minorities, people with disabilities. And so when you, and this is now mainstream recognized in the field of disaster risk reduction, that discrimination is a determining factor in who suffers harm in disasters. And if you see discrimination as a central feature in the refugee definition, and that takes a little bit of recalibration of dominant approaches, but if you see discrimination as central, and you see discrimination also as central to harm in a disaster context, then you're asking maybe more the right question, like can an individual who presents themselves as a refugee, can they establish that on return discrimination will contribute to their exposure to serious harm? Now, that's going to crash and burn in the USA, unfortunately, because you've got an intention requirement, and this is where those kind of legal barriers questions that you posed in the beginning pop up, where some jurisdictions interpret the refugee definition one way, where you really need a mean actor of persecution singling out someone to cause them harm, and then you have more expansive human rights-based interpretations where you're looking more at the predicament of the individual and the wider discriminatory social context. And that's the kind of stuff that James Hathaway and Michelle Foster have been writing a lot about. And I think that's the way forward. And I think that's the direction UNHCR is advocating as well. But if Jeff Sessions has anything to say about it, perhaps even gender-based violence doesn't fall within a particular social group ground anymore. And that's cause for concern.
Yes. All right. Well, I would like to open it up to all of you. I'm sure you have plenty of questions. Floor is open. Any questions? No questions? I could keep asking questions, but I bet you have some. Yes. Yeah.
This is more to Matthew, maybe you can also reflect upon that. And I'm just hearing today, for example, that I know you probably have followed the situation in New Zealand concerning some of the applications for asylum for family refugees that have been turned aside, but I'm sure some of the political processes have changed. There's now a new coalition with the Green Party that's in New Zealand. And I'm just hearing, for example, that they're going to develop a special visa for family refugees. How do you think that is going to in any way change some of the perception around what is the you're going to do?
You get that, or do you want me to repeat the question?
No, I got it. It relates to New Zealand's new policy on climate refugees getting visas. Thanks for that question. I think New Zealand seems to be really path breaking in both the policy level as well as in its jurisprudence on this question. Even though I was critical about the idea of a new international treaty, I think whenever a state says we're going to do our best to help some people adversely affected by climate change to come and live in this place or spend some time here, I think that's a fantastic initiative and it has to be celebrated. I think it got some criticism for those reasons that I mentioned. You know, who are you going to decide who's going to come? But however the mechanism works, it sends a very significant signal to the neighborhood in the Pacific, as well as internationally, that some states are stepping up to take responsibility, and that's really positive. It's not the only example. There are other initiatives maybe that don't call themselves climate refugee visas. I know that Brazil was very active in the context of the Haitian earthquake in 2010. They even issued humanitarian visas from their consulate or embassy in Port-au-Prince. And Australia also has a mechanism for bringing some people from Kiribati to Australia for training up in the health sector. So there are those initiatives, and I think they should be celebrated. Just an aside, the New Zealand Immigration and Protection Tribunal has really been path-breaking in its jurisprudence on climate refugees. You'll read it all over the media if you Google it, but there have been a number of climate refugee claims made there, and the member of the Immigration Protection Tribunal, Bruce Burleson, has put a lot of effort into clarifying the kind of parameters for considering these claims, just as you would consider any other refugee case, and he did a great job doing it.
Other questions?
That's another one.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. I just want to follow up on this issue as well. Couple of years, many years back, in Africa, we understand the whole issue about the farming that came up in Ethiopia, and very serious issue where hundreds of thousands of people were really affected. And as we see in terms of the sort of devastating impact of climate change in terms of food security and all as well, do you see a situation where in the future, where, for example, drought or erratic rainfall, other things, or flood that would create food security and enable farming that in a way that will open some of the windows for trying to look at the humanitarian angle and trying to address that like climate refugees. Especially if we reference the history of what happened in Ethiopia.
That one for me too?
Yeah.
It's for the panel.
I can start. Thanks. What I got from that question concerned drought and famine and what that has to whether we can anticipate that generating some kind of humanitarian response in the future.
Yeah.
I think, well, a couple of observations probably. I'm concerned about the international humanitarian infrastructure being overstretched, as it already is, and I think that presents real challenges for how the international community responds to these large-scale humanitarian emergencies. And I think as a consequence, we need to be thinking proactively about mobility as an adaptation strategy. If we can see that in coming years, I mean, we already see it, for example, with the recurrent droughts and high levels of food insecurity in Somalia and other places. intersecting with conflict often. Anticipating that promotes thinking about migration as adaptation. If some people can leave those situations, whether in a circular migration pattern or some other kind of mechanism within the region or further afield, then other people can be helped to stay at home longer through remittances and other kind of solutions. So that's another part of the toolkit that I think is important to have in mind, that it's not just about the Refugee Convention, but it's about finding practical, pragmatic solutions to really resource-intensive challenges that have massive impacts on human lives, and that we can expect to be far greater in the future. Certainly in Africa, food insecurity is expected to rise significantly as a consequence of droughts and erratic rainfall and heat waves and so on. So, there's also a role then for the African Union to play there and for the regional economic communities. IGAD is doing a study now on displacement in the context of disasters and climate change in that region. I think there's a bit of an initiative going on within the ECOWAS states. So again, then we see the regional context for this and the regional institutions having a clear role to play. Because the reality, I think, is also that most of the people who move, as we've heard a couple times today, they don't move to Europe or to the USA or to Australia, where we have really robust refugee status determination procedures. They move short distances and often within their own countries or to neighboring countries. So that's where the mechanisms need to be really focused on. And that includes also regional free movement arrangements, which you also have in quite a lot of countries. So those kind of mechanisms could also be strengthened.
Yes.
So my question is a little bit about language, and I'm wondering what each of you think about this reproduction of the term climate refugee, because it has no legal definition. Do we want to perpetuate talking about climate-induced migrants as climate refugees, and sort of what damages do you see coming out of this colloquial use of climate refugee?
So I'll say something briefly. I mean, I don't know that I can fully speak to the international law implications of it. I do know that as in our work on this, we've really struggled with what the appropriate terminology is. And I think we've ended up talking about climate displacement, and that may not be the right terminology at all, but it seemed to be the most sort of generic or universal way of talking about it, because refugees sort of implies there's a particular category you fall into. Migrant has certain associations with it as well. Displacement may have its own problems because it sort of implies a passivity, perhaps. But it is a struggle, and I don't know that we have it.
I think I would agree with that. I mean, since my organization is particularly focused on people who do qualify for the refugee definition or qualify for the asylum definition, it's a little hard to answer that. Yeah.
Yes, that's.
I can't see the other panelists, so I don't know if you finished.
Yes.
Okay. I think it's a huge problem, but at the same time, it has a catchiness to it. Whenever you say climate refugees, people know exactly what you're talking about, and most people don't see it as problematic because maybe in this room we all know what the refugee definition means, but on the street or reading newspapers, you get it. When you say climate refugees, people know that it's movement in the context of changing climate, and that gets attention, but it's pretty much universally condemned from an academic or international legal approach. I think we need a kind of neologism. I think, whenever I wrote about it or write about it or speak about it, I say displacement in the context of disasters and climate change. Now try a headline about that. people have to leave their homes in the context of disasters and climate change, having regard to the multiplicity of other factors that contribute. It just doesn't fit on the page. So you need some kind of catchy term that means something. And there, climate refugees does it a little bit, notwithstanding international legal implications. So probably it depends on the context. But it's true that the term refugees, unfortunately, has a lot of negative connotations right now, politically, and amongst people who are directly affected. You hear a lot of people saying, we're not climate refugees. That's expressly said by people on Kiribati who don't want to leave and don't want to be considered refugees. So it's a great question, and nobody, I think, has a good neologism yet. Maybe a competition would be a good idea. Get a bunch of Greek scholars together, or maybe Sanskrit. Take it out of the Eurocentric perspective and get some other name. I think it would be great.
So I think we have about 5 minutes left. Why don't we try to squeeze in 2 more questions? Okay, Tyler, do you have your hand?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about these questions. Talk about at the local level, but and at the international level, how do you take care of the funding question on the budget side?
Can I add my question?
Sure, yeah, and yes, absolutely, great.
Because it's a little related to the previous question. And I raised this in the previous panel about the responsibility of the global when it comes to climate change, because it's predominantly created by the global north, but there's a disproportionate impact on the global south. So this goes to the legal question about legal responsibility as well as the resource question. And to add to your question, many of these people who are being displaced do not want to be called refugees because it has a negative connotation. So that's another complexity. And a quick question to Matthew. You mentioned this toolkit several times. I was wondering what you meant by that and what's in it.
Okay, budget. These are really easy questions here. Okay. Where's the money coming from? And what tool? Where's that toolkit that we all? Do you want, Shaun? Do you want to on the budget question?
I'll say a bit about that, and it's there's definitely no easy answer to that. In fact, it is pretty much an intractable problem. If you look just say at the east coast of the United States, it's clear that with sea level rise, it's not going to be possible to build coastal coast. So some communities are going to have the money for them, and some are not, and there are going to be significant distributional implications of that. Or conversely, if you're talking about retreating, if you want to use a buyout as a tool for that, the value of real estate along the coast is in trillions of dollars. We are not going to be able to give full fair market value buyouts to everyone on the coast as we retreat. And so those are hard choices we're going to have to make. And there's a real danger that it's going to perpetuate inequities the way this is going to be carried out.
Okay, Matthew, you want to have the last word on this? Money and tools.
Yeah, the money question it was totally mute to me. I'm not very good with budgets, so I'm not sure either. But I think the money. I'm probably not answering your question, Tyler, because I didn't hear it. But the money has to be directed at the source, I think, in terms of budgets for climate change adaptation and disaster risk management. And you need substantially more money directed there than currently is. I have no idea actually how much goes into it, but it's probably about as much as the world spends buying chiclets every year. So lots more money directed at the source. I don't know if that answers the question at all or not. Partly also because I'm looking up these effective practices that Samudu asked about. And I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on page 29 of the Protection Agenda, which is the final product of the multi-year, multi-region consultation process of the Nansen Initiative, the agenda was adopted or endorsed by 109 states, and it was focused on articulating effective practices. And these include, for example, providing persons with humanitarian protection measures, such as suspending their deportation or extending or changing existing migration status on humanitarian grounds. If, for example, they face extreme hardship on return, or there's been disaster in the country, you could have allowing cross-border disaster-displaced persons to apply for renewed or permanent residency, support cultural and familial ties when return to the country of origin isn't possible, so family reunion mechanisms. It's that kind of toolkit that says we've got existing systems for mobility already. When you have a situation of climate change or disasters, try to make it easier for people to fit within those existing categories and try to develop new ones at the local or at the regional or bilateral level. The toolkit includes the Refugee Convention, it includes international or regional human rights law, and it includes immigration law in its many, many guises.
Well, on that note, thank you. Those are tools going forward. And thank you all for being with us today.
Came out 2 years ago, and it's about
and about all
So
of
I
the
have
compliance-related
steps
impacts that have to do with the mustard, especially
Similar thing, it's just one that I have to do.
Hi.
so that one's short. I might pick that one.
I don't know.
Can you hear us?
Oh,
Oh, maybe this is the one I read.
Hi, I'm just undoing my headphones. Can you hear me?
No, I think I want to do
Yeah,
It was just, you know, like,
radio
things
is
like
all.
that.
Let me fix that. Just go, but I'm sorry. Like, thank you.
Right, well, this idea.
Yeah.
So it's not, each access, make it works. And that's, I think, what's happening.
Thank you so much. This is very interesting.
I have,
members of the travelers.
oh, yeah, the only things I have is, I parked, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, there's like an orange thing over there. Can you hear me, Professor Burleson?
I can, yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Can I speak
hear
loud
you.
enough?
No, we can hear it. The room is just really loud. We can hear it.
Understood. Okay. I'll turn audio off because it sounds like you have another 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, your video is just a little bit shaky.
Start or what was the key? Shake.
Yeah, so we want you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, great.
I missed the key part. You said the video.
The room is really loud. I can't hear you right now unless I like turn you up. We're just gonna try and get so you can.
You're definitely cutting in and out. Am I cutting in and out as well? That 4 sentences you said, I got half of every sentence.
Okay, so we're just on our for about the next 10 minutes. We are going to start a here start. And if you're all set, you can hear us and we can hear you. So yeah.
Okay. My only question was I could actually hear better on the Facebook stream, and I'm wondering if it'll mess up if there'll be any feedback if
No.
keep that stream volume on because.
So the reason why you can hear that better is because everyone's talking right now, but when everyone quiets down, you'll be able to hear it pretty well through the annotation.
Okay.
Yeah?
So leave the face stream off because there will be feedback.
I would turn it off for a little bit.
That's my instinct as well.
Yeah. And also, where I'm standing right now, the worst place to hear, but you'll be able to hear from where I was standing earlier.
Okay, because you're cutting in and out, but it might be all that equipment you're standing next to.
It's where I'm standing right now.
Okay. All right.
Just so that
you just give me the thumbs up when you want me to start speaking.
Yeah.
Well, you have 10 more minutes.
We still have an audience. Late on Friday, and I talked to I told you. Can you hear it? Beautiful background. Professor Burleson, can you hear us?
I can, yes.
Perfect. Yeah. Please get it. Yeah, she's seeing.
Welcome everyone to our last panel. Huge thank you to those who have been here since the morning, and also welcome for those who just came in. So for our final panel, the theme is Beyond Borders. And so we're going to be looking to the future of borders and an opportunity to rethink the future of migration, what borders will look like in a rapidly changing world, and examining both the legal and physical aspects that we discussed in the earlier panels. This is a chance where we can all come together. And our moderator for the last panel is Dr. Elizabeth Ennen, the acting director of the Program on Human Rights in the Global Economy at the Northeastern University School of Law. And she'll be briefly introducing our panelists.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all for staying with us for the last panel of the day. One of the striking elements of that the borders that separate the three panels have been extraordinarily porous. And I think it's a beautiful feature, not a bug of the day. We've today been talking about issues at the intersection of climate change, migration, and human rights. And as we have seen, issues are incredibly difficult and important. So we are very, very fortunate to have with us today three panelists who, in virtue of their expertise and experience, will be able to shed light on those issues and help us think through them critically. We're going to try to do something a little different with this panel. It's late in the day on a Friday. We are going to try to foster a genuine conversation among the panelists. We will see how it goes. I invite the panelists to imagine that you are, even though you're physically distant from one another, sitting around a lovely table for a dinner party, and to listen to one another with it in mind that after you each speak, you'll have the opportunity to question one another, press each other on the claims that you're making, think collaboratively about solutions, and so on and so forth. So we'll see how that works. I know it's a bit of a challenge given the technology involved, but I have faith that this will go well. I will begin by introducing all three of the speakers. Then I will invite each speaker to address the crowd for approximately 5 minutes. Then we will imagine that we are listening and learning from their dinner party conversation, and then we will open it up to the audience. Our first panelist is behind me on the screen. We welcome Professor Elizabeth Burleson to Northeastern Law School. Thank you very much for being with us today. Professor Burleson parlayed her LLM in international law from the London School of Economics into a fascinating and impressive career as an attorney, professor, scholar, consultant, and advocate. She is the founding director of the Burleson Institute, a non-government organization that conducts commissioned research on issues related to environmental justice. As the director of the Burleson Institute, Professor Burleson serves as a consultant to the United Nations Climate Technology Center and Network, and provides expert advice to the United Nations, developed and developing countries, NGOs, and other organizations. She also provides legal advice to developing countries through the Legal Response Initiative coordinated at Columbia Law School. She has deep expertise in human rights and climate change. She began participating in the treaty negotiation process in the United Nations back in 1991 to draft the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. By my count, and please correct me if I'm wrong, since 2007 she has served as a delegate to all but one of the yearly United Nations climate change conferences. As a law professor and senior Fulbright scholar, she has taught and published on energy law, human rights and the environment, international environmental law, water law, United Nations law, and a variety of related topics. And we are thrilled to have her. Professor Burleson with us today. Our second panelist is Professor Tyler Giannini, who comes to us from Harvard Law School, where he is the co-director of the Human Rights Program and the co-director of the International Human Rights Clinic. He holds graduate degrees in law and foreign policy from UVA, where he is a member of the Law Review. Prior to joining the faculty at Harvard, he was a founder and director of Earth Rights International, an organization devoted to linking human rights and environmental protection. As part of his work with Earth Rights International, he spent a decade in Thailand, conducting fact-finding investigations and pursuing groundbreaking corporate accountability litigation. And I found this fascinating, is fluent in Thai. His work at Harvard focuses on corporate accountability litigation, business and human rights in the environment. He has specific expertise on the harmful effects of large dams, transitional justice, abuses related to the mining industry, and the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. Of particular interest today is Professor Giannini's work on climate change displacement and the possibility of a convention on climate change refugees. So I understand his thinking on that topic has changed since the article I recently read about his thoughts in 2009 on that issue. So we'll TBA. In addition to his human rights work, Professor Giannini has a strong interest in clinical pedagogy and has received a prestigious teaching award at Harvard from the class of 2000. Welcome to Northeastern Law School. We're thrilled that you're here today with us. It's a personal honor and privilege to introduce to you Alex Tarzikhan, who is someone I know personally and for whom I have the greatest of respect. She will soon earn her law degree here at Northeastern Law, and she will also soon earn a master's degree in public health from Tufts Medical School. Alex left her hometown Aleppo, Syria in 2011 to pursue an undergraduate degree here in the United States. When she got on the plane, she did not realize the war that had begun was going to escalate to the point that she would be unable to return home. She's been deeply removed by the plight of Syrian refugees who have fled this war and have become trapped in refugee camps in Greece and its surrounding countries. Since 2016, she has volunteered or served as an intern in refugee camps in Greece on 3 separate occasions. Most recently, I'm proud to say, she traveled to Greece on a Fergie Fellowship, a fellowship for outstanding law students here that is supported by the Program on Human Rights in the Global Economy. When she works in the camps, she does a variety of things. Let me give you a few examples. She gives English lessons, she helps with crowd control, she provides site management, she conducts surveys and needs assessment, she provides first aid and other health-related trainings, she provides referrals to legal aid organizations. She patrols the camps on day shifts and night shifts. She monitors the ocean for boat landings and welcomes the refugees as they come. When she's not working in the camps or fulfilling the demanding requirements of 2 different degrees, Alex has been working here in Boston to further the cause of refugees. She served for 2 years as the co-director of the International Refugee Assistance Project here at NUSL. She created an initiative to help resettle Syrian refugees in Boston. She has created a very powerful page called Meet a Refugee. I urge you all to go look at it. It's her effort to humanize refugees and promote their cause through putting the faces to these stories. She gave a TEDx talk last year at Tufts about her work with refugees. It's available online. I urge you to go Google it, watch it, and be inspired by it. Thank you very much for joining us. So I thought we would start with Professor Burleson. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
All right. I would like to pull some things together, having listened to the full day. And I think, responding to the notion of what this book looked like, I firmly believe that the arc of humanity is still bending upwards, and Martin Luther King's vision is still happening. It's just happening across many different cross-sectoral venues. So most recently, we've got the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration that is doing in part what the NANS initiative has been doing for quite some time, but with a more global participation, and has a kind of text. And it's focusing on bilateral, regional, multilateral coordination. And its objective number 2 is to minimize the adverse drivers and structural factors that compel people to leave their countries of origin. Yeah, can you hear me?
I apologize deeply. We are allowed to have technology, so we're going to call somebody from computer services to come help us.
Can you, is it a volume issue? Is it too soft? Or?
If you lean in, that appears to.
Okay, leaning in. All right. So, better?
Yes.
All right. So we have this global compact in migration, and we have the Nansen Initiative, and the objective number 2 of the global compact on migration is trying to minimize adverse drivers and structural factors that compel people to leave their countries of origin. And I think it's important to try and pull in from the human rights and environment field generally some of the procedural environmental human rights. And they can be found in NEPA, they can be found in the Rio Declaration, they can be found in the Refugee Convention, and they have their core, these 3 pillars of access to information, public participation, and access to justice. And if you look at that in the context of what I'd call still, a mouthful, but climate disaster cross-border displacement, albeit it doesn't roll off your tongue as nicely as climate refugees, but if you look at it across those themes, you have the field of disaster reduction, and you've got frameworks on disaster reduction that are ongoing discussions at the UN and regional. You have efforts underway at the bilateral, regional, and multilateral levels on supporting civil society, building resilience of not just nation states to contend with unwieldy movement of people across borders, but also the civil society that is more enmeshed and engaged in these cultures. And everyone comes with their personal identity, but also their culture. It was said earlier today that there is now a firm belief that the ability to stay within one's, say, village in the Arctic or Louisiana tribe that's now got federal funds to displace together, or actually stay put and not have to displace, there's now an increasing recognition that that needs to be supported and needs to be funded. And whether it's seed funding to NGOs trying to work with those communities, it's about more than just disaster response in the form of early warning systems with a siren that say a hurricane or flood or fires are imminently over the horizon and get out now. That too is important, but we can go beyond that. And that's part of the notion of access to information, but it doesn't have to be SOS access to information, more broadly access to information of what's already underway and what some of these international principles can lead to. Because right now, our modus operandi of creating international law is often to start with collective understanding of some language, some wrestling with short-term versus long-term, factors, drivers, internal versus external displacement, and we've started to really have, defining features well understood, but that doesn't necessarily help the people who are in harm's way and needing to cross borders effectively. And so these guiding principles often then lead to declarations and compacts and stuff, and then ultimately in many different areas of international law become binding international obligations. And sometimes there's a framework that's somewhat vague, and sometimes there's protocols that drill down more specifically in different areas. But ultimately, we want the collection of nation states to take their collective responsibility to protect seriously. And as was said earlier in the day, in the refugee context, that's well understood. Whether it's always implemented effectively is another matter, but it's well understood that collectively we are trying to protect people in harm's way. And that's based in a very, very deep-seated international, faith in reciprocity that is deep-seated in many cultures. And engaging in intercultural celebrations, intercultural respect is a means by which for not just funds to become available, be they seed funds or be they, more effective broad-scale response, disaster response. We're pretty good at making large sums of money available after horrendous immediate disasters. We're less good at recognizing long-standing rights for people who absolutely huge cross borders, international borders in particular, and have those rights that citizens have, and not necessarily that citizens have, but the face. So hopefully that's a starting point for a conversation, and I think it's worth keeping in mind that there's both procedural and substantive rights that can be stepping stones for bringing this together, whether it happens in a single treaty or whether it happens across a number of treaties that are already in place or emerging. And it needs to happen within the climate context, the refugee context, and everywhere at this point. The discussion needs to be underway effectively. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's take a moment here just to talk about technology. We have Jacob is here from our technology team. Our later conversation. We want to try two things quickly. If you could move the laptop an inch or two forward from you, and we'll test further away from you. Is that right?
Oh, paper. I think
And if you could also just make sure to keep the papers away from.
Sorry, the mic.
Yeah.
It magnifies the rustling, but I
apologize.
But this is much better, right? Yeah. Okay. So this is much better for the discussion.
Hadn't video conferenced it in a while.
No, thank you very, very much. And we apologize for this. Professor Giannini.
So thank you. And first I have to do a check to see if people can hear me in the back. All right. Good acoustics in here. Not good. Is that better? Not so good still. Still a technology problem. It's just my voice. Okay, I'll do my best to project for you. But can we use the mic?
The mics don't work as long as we have.
All right, I'll do my best.
Where's the wireless mic? Did that work, or is it going to cause?
It's going to cause feedback. All right, so I can't do much about my voice itself.
But everyone can move down. There's so much room.
Yes, please join us.
If you can't hear me. All right, so in thinking about this question of beyond borders, I wanted to first start with a couple of situations that, for me, help ground the question. And then I wanted to take a look at where I think we are, and then maybe where we can go. So the three situations. First, at our clinic and in coordination with Shaun's clinic, we looked at a couple of case studies. One of those was looking at Somalia and pastoralists. And when you look at the situation there, you've got 50% of the population who are pastoralists. So if we're looking decades out, we're basically looking at the reconfiguration, if the trends around drought and climate change continue, of an entire reconfiguration of the society. So what do we do with that from a question from legal and governance? The second is, in looking at East Coast cities, we looked at what I would call a double displacement scenario. So in southern Florida, you're already starting to see this, where initially the property value is along the coast, and so the rich elite buy up the coast. Now they're starting to say, oh, we need to move to elevated areas. And so you're already getting a market effect of people buying up where the poorer populations were before. Now, so that's the first displacement. The poorer populations are probably going to move down to the coastal areas. The second displacement is going to be then when you have acute events like hurricanes or sea level rise, who's going to suffer the most? The lower class communities. We know the intersectionality of that with race and gender inequalities. And so we have that kind of scenario as well. These are already emerging, but they're going to be chronic going forward. And then the third one is a more acute event, which we've seen, hurricanes. You can contrast Puerto Rico with Houston. I don't really need to say more than that. We know what that means. And so those are three different situations that are not going to go away, both in the short term in those contexts, but they're going to be recurring. And so that's just keep those in the back of your mind, and I'll come back to them. Now, where are we now? For me, the entire conversation around climate change displacement has to be situated on what I see as structural and chronic power imbalances that persist and are already in place.